going to talk about non-Tuberculous Mycobacteria in water and waterborne infections, and these are rising in importance. I've just been asked to join the water safety group for the new hospital programme, so water is increasingly being taken as really important, and getting it right from the design stage is really vital. British Standards Organisation have been doing a lot of work over the last few years. We've put together a package of water hygiene standards, starting with an update on the Legionella standard, and I hope you're all aware of the need, absolute legal requirement for Legionella risk assessments. We first started work, the first one was published in 2010. I've been a member of the committee that produces these standards for over 20 years now. And the reason that we felt it was necessary to provide a standard on risk assessment was that the ones that we were seeing during outbreak investigations, and I worked for the Public Health Laboratory Service and the Health Protection Agency before becoming independent, following supposed to be retirement, but I think I'm working harder than ever, was that the ones that were produced were quite often not worth the paper they were written on. They were being put out there by contractors as a loss leader to gain work by finding things during the risk assessment process, and really to make a buck for themselves. Producing this standard did make a big difference. It's referenced in the Health and Safety Executive's Code of Practice, and it was just updated really to reflect some of the findings from outbreaks and investigations over the years. It has a partner in crime, which is the sampling for Legionella bacteria, and again, this was an update only published last year. And that includes now the need to have a sampling plan. And also there's some information in there for sampling during commissioning processes, which was left out of the initial standard, but has increasingly been seen to be vital to ensure that at handover we're getting Legionella-free premises. In 2020, we published water quality, water safety plans, and the need for a water safety plan as being included in much guidance, including in the Health and Social Care Act Code of Practice, as a need to protect patients from environmental organisms, including Legionella, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and others that could pose a risk of harm to patients from environmental waterborne pathogens. I'd worked with WHO, and we published in 2011 a water safety in buildings, and this built on the work that had been done in improving the quality of drinking water from source to point of entry into the building. And it's moving away from what was a sample-based approach to water safety to one that looked at the points where contamination could enter the system and putting multiple barriers in place. It built on the HACCP approach that is used in the food industry, that was first developed to make sure that astronauts going into space didn't suffer from diarrhea and vomiting. And I think, just give you a second to think about that in a zero gravity environment is really something that maybe we don't want to think about as infection control specialists. Following that, and the need for risk assessments, particularly for Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and finding the same problem that these were being handed out to contractors with absolutely no idea of the clinical need to be involved in this risk assessment process, to actually look at what was going on in the wards, what sources of exposure, what routes of transmission there were for these pathogens. And I very much pushed to get this standard out there and chaired the working group that produced this standard. It is very much focused on Pseudomonas aeruginosa. That is the primary pathogen of concern in healthcare premises. But also there is quite a large section on non-Tuberculous Mycobacteria, which of course has been posing as increasing concern, especially following the deaths at Petworth. So do we need this standard? We absolutely do, despite the fact that it's 1976, Legionella, the first outbreak of Legionnaire's disease. It was actually identified in 1977, but we are still seeing unnecessary deaths in healthcare premises from waterborne pathogens. And we have learnt a lot over the years. Unfortunately, we don't tend to do anything until we've had an outbreak. We've known for years of the problems with Pseudomonas infections, including in neonates, but it wasn't until we got the outbreak that actually guidance was put out there by the Department of Health. We learnt a lot about cuprovirus from the Glasgow hospital that has been in the news, and there's still an ongoing public inquiry as to what went on there, but problems with design and commissioning certainly featured in the waterborne deaths that were seen associated with that hospital. And of course, more recently, we have seen the problems in Petworth. So healthcare-associated waterborne infections are not just Legionella, as lots of people still seem to think, or even Pseudomonas aeruginosa. Increasingly, we are aware of NTM infections, but there are many other, particularly gram-negative species, which have been shown to be associated with exposure to water. And also protozoal infections and some fungal infections as well. And this list is continuing to grow. And as we see better laboratory techniques to identify waterborne pathogens, I suspect this list is going to keep on growing. And we need to be aware and have the surveillance in place, and I mean clinical surveillance as well as environmental surveillance, to make sure that we are able to identify when we have a cluster of maybe unknown organisms that they could be associated with water, and have plans already in place as to how we're going to go about identifying those and making the association. So how do we manage the problem? Well, WHO have published an update of their guidelines for drinking water quality in 2022 and repeated what they have been saying for many years, that all healthcare facilities should have specific water safety plans as part of their infection control programme. And these should address not just the water quality and treatment, looking at the point from the point of entry all the way through to the point of use, but also cleaning of specialised equipment and the control of microbial growth, not just in the distributed system, but also in any ancillary equipment or in any ancillary systems, such as in hydrotherapy pools, for example, dialysis equipment. And it uses this HACCP-based approach that I mentioned, and it encompasses all the steps from the supply, looking at all hazards, all potential hazardous events, and making sure that we have effective controls, multiple barriers to prevent ingress and manage the risk to acceptable levels. And of course, that acceptable level will depend on the vulnerability of those who are going to be exposed, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail later. But the difference between a HACCP-based food plan and water safety plan is that it is surrounded by supporting programs such as communication, audit, surveillance, and training. And the idea is that we put all that information and we use it to actually improve our infection control based on our data. So BS 8680 is the underlying standard, and this is the one that helps you to put together and implement an effective water safety plan. And it starts right from the concept stage of a building all the way through the construction process to commissioning, installation, normal operations, so right from design. And the time that you need to get what water quality needs you have is right at the concept stage, before it even goes out to tender specification. You need to make sure as an infection control specialist professionals that you, if there is a new building proposed, that you are in there before they even start to put pen to paper to write out the tender specification, because if we don't get the needs of the patient articulated right at that first stage, it's not going to happen, because once they've gone out to tender, then there is a cost implications, because everybody is actually tendering to that specification. So getting in there early is essential to make sure that any new build, any new unit for high-risk patients is going to actually deliver water of a quality that is safe for those patients, and making sure that the patient is at the focus of any new build, not how quick it can be built and how cheaply. So right at the design stage, we need to articulate what we need for a safe building for the intended patient groups. And we're looking not just at microbial hazards, but the potential for chemical hazards, depending on the type of materials that are used, the biocides that are used, whether it's for a dialysis unit, where certain chemicals in water could be lethal to those patients. We need to identify all of those hazards right at the beginning and make sure that our water safety plan includes those. And also physical hazards, say slipping, putting sluice rooms at far ends of the wards so that you've got to carry water and there's an increased risk of slipping instead of centralising them. There's all sorts of things that are considered that you might not have even thought about until you actually go through the water safety plan development process. So it's based on, the water safety plan is based on prevention rather than relying on water sampling. Water sampling, a negative result, does not mean that the intended pathogen is not there. It's not a very precise science. If you take a sample just after an outlet's been used, well, that first flush may have contained millions of microorganisms, but by the time it's been used for a while, you may get a negative sample. That will be a false negative that won't necessarily be indicating the highest risk to the patients. So timing of sampling is important. And if you have just a small amount of biofilm that is sloughed off, that can contain thousands, millions sometimes of bacteria. And again, that may be in one sample bottle that maybe goes for chemical analysis and not in the one for microbiological analysis. You cannot rely on water sampling results to tell you your system is safe, not unless you take repeated samples over a long period of time so that you're looking at trend analysis as opposed to intermittent sampling. And just a little dig at the current guidance for Pseudomonas sampling. It is a nonsense to be taking samples every 6 months for Pseudomonas. You might as well just go like that. Because, again, they will be growing at the outlet. Somebody flushes it, you get a negative sample. Patient colonized, comes up, handles that outlet, contaminates the outlet. Within a few minutes of you actually taking your sample and the result coming back negative. So you need to be doing trend analysis, which is deviating slightly from what I was going to talk about, but it's a really important point and one that people don't necessarily get. So water safety plans fit into this WHO framework for safe water. It's mainly based on system assessment, risk assessment, making sure that you're monitoring your system. That's not just by sampling. That's looking at your temperature controls, looking at your biocide controls, making sure that the real-time parameters that can be monitored are monitored and reviewed at regular intervals. And we have to adapt that slightly for healthcare premises to make sure that we take into account all types of water exposure, all types of waterborne pathogen, all the hazards and hazardous events, and that we make sure that we are communicating the risks to those who need to protect the patients at every stage. So we need first a good Legionella risk assessment. This is the basis, the core of the water safety plan, because this is the bit that looks at all the engineering controls. And if you've got that right, then you don't need to do that again when you come to do your risk assessments for the NTMs and the other waterborne pathogens. So making sure that you've got a good Legionella risk assessment is the first step in any assessment for other waterborne pathogens. It's a legal requirement as well. But the competence of the assessor is really key to making sure you've got an effective risk assessment, and not enough effort is actually put into making sure that those who are assessing the systems have got the competence, not just for the water and distribution, but for whatever other uses you have in a healthcare environment, which are many and varied. And if the assessor isn't competent, then your risk assessment isn't going to be worth the paper that it's written on. So, it is really important to make sure. You have to have an asset register and a schematic drawings that are up to date. And this is so that you've got a list of things that need maintenance, which could pose a risk and need a risk assessment. And you need to review that regularly. And hopefully, I'm sort of almost teaching grandmothers to suck eggs here. I hope that you all do this on a regular basis. And looking at the gaps, filling them and getting a good report that gives you an action plan so that you can make sure that your Legionella, your engineering component of assessment, is up to date and valid. So when we come to part 2, which is looking at how we risk assess other waterborne pathogens, then we've done the engineering bit. But we need to make sure that we have a good multidisciplinary group who understand all the uses of water, how water is used, how patients are using it, what they're doing with water. I've been on auditing one instance, a kidney dialysis unit, kidney transplant unit, and the patients were bringing or getting their relatives to bring in bottled water because they didn't like the taste of the hospital water. But bottled water contains high level of Pseudomonas aeruginosa quite frequently. So not understanding the risks or knowing what people are doing. In other instances, TPN being made up in the ward kitchen, which was not cleaned by the staff who'd been taught to clean the taps and the outlets properly, because that wasn't seen. Sorry, I'm thickened drinks, not TPN. But TPN in clean sluice rooms where there's a sink which splashes onto the counter where they're making up drinks. So you need that clinical input, that understanding of what the risks are when you're carrying out these risk assessments. So if you think about all the potential sources of exposure in a hospital environment, there are many of them that need to be considered, and you need to have the necessary expertise in those areas to make sure that those assessments are going to be valid and take account of the way that water is used and the particular risks associated with each type of use. There's there's a nice paper from CDC in the USA, which looked at the costs associated with these biofilm organisms. And the ones that we are talking about in this risk assessment are the ones that are associated with biofilms. We're not talking about fecal contamination. That's usually a one-off event. So we're talking about these biofilm-associated pathogens, so NTM, Pseudomonas, and Legionella. And they reckon it was costing the US, they calculate it's costing the US economy $2.39 billion annually. And surprisingly, when you looked at the diseases causing the most number of deaths, then NTMs were the highest on their list. And I was quite surprised when I saw those figures. There is a global rise in NTM infections, and we're not sure why that is. There is better ascertainment. There is better identification, but we really don't know why. Maybe it's because there's more immunosuppressed, there are more transplants being carried out. I suspect it's multifactorial. So the risk assessment team need to understand the organism that they're risk assessing for. So they need to understand the ecology, where it's likely to be found, the temperatures that it's likely to grow at, whether it grows in protozoa, which give it protection from biocides and heat, where it can be encysted and it can be carried in dust. They need to know what the potential sources might be, where they should be looking, the relevant modes of exposure and transmission pathways, as well as the relevant methods for detection and identification. They also need to understand the susceptible groups and the means of effective control. So it may be that you don't have the necessary expertise within your water safety group, and you need to bring in that expertise if it isn't there already. And quite often, a good water safety group, multidisciplinary water safety group, will include the ward managers. It will include cleaning supervisors. It's a good idea to have somebody from finance there, because then they're aware of how much it's going to cost and you can get their buy-in. Epidemiologists, IPC specialists, those involved in clinical surveillance, but you do need engineers, facilities managers as well to put together this team. There is no one person who can go and do a risk assessment for these other pathogens than Legionella. It needs a multidisciplinary input. You need to communicate. So just a quick overview in case some of you aren't as familiar. These are a diverse group of free-living Mycobacterium. They're acid-fast bacteria. Over 200 species now have been identified. Approximately half of those are associated with causing infections. They are intrinsically resistant to antibiotics, particularly Mycobacterium abscessus is thought to be the most resistant organism. They can cause pulmonary disease as well as extrapulmonary disease, including in bone disseminated disease. And they affect those patients who are at the highest risk of infection. Infections generally through inhalation via aerosols, but also aspiration or maybe direct contact, particularly if somebody's got indwelling catheters and they're not protected sufficiently when going for showers, if it is deemed that it's safe for them to do so. So, commonly found in water and soil, especially in constructed water systems and equipment, can colonize medical equipment. We probably all know about the Mycobacteria chimera in heater coolers associated with the heart surgery. But because they're ubiquitous in water, they are going to be there in the incoming water. They have also live in biofilms, and this makes them highly resistant, especially because their outer coat is really tough for any biocide to access. So they're highly resistant to disinfectants. The normal levels of disinfectant that we use in a water distribution system is not going to be effective against NTMs. They're also very heat tolerant, so our normal controls of heat in a hospital's distribution system is not going to be effective at controlling these bugs. They are not contaminants of water. This is their natural home. This is where they live. like Legionella, like Pseudomonas aeruginosa, they will be there in the incoming water. It's unlikely that you will be able to detect them unless you use incredibly large volumes of water to actually concentrate down to see if you can find them. And in the days where we used to look at Legionella in supply water, we'll be looking at tens of litres of water to be able to detect them, because at low temperatures in the supply water, they're probably going to be viable but non-culturable. If you're having trouble seeing, why don't you come a bit closer to the front? They rarely cause harm to the normal population, even in healthcare premises. So we know they are there. Most of us are in contact, being exposed to them all the time. It's very unlikely that we are going to be infected. Like Legionella infects about 1 in 10, even when 1 in 100, even when it's in high numbers and it's Legionella pneumophilus serogroup 1. This is much rarer to get these infections unless you are extremely vulnerable. They can be subdivided into slow-growing and rapid-growing acid-fast bacteria. The slow-growing include the Mycobacterium avium complex, including Chimera, and these are the ones that you are likely to find that laboratories that are accredited for the slow-growing ones. These can take about 6 weeks to grow in the laboratory. It's not the most sensitive of methods. In a dirty water, then you have to do a decontamination step, and that is very harsh, usually using alkali to take out the background organism, and of course that's going to decrease the sensitivity of detection. In the USA, MAC, including intracellular, are reported to be responsible for about 80% of NTM infections. The ones that are causing us the most concern are these rapidly growing Mycobacterium, which includes the Mycobacterium abscessus complex. It's responsible for about 10% of the non-Tuberculous pulmonary disease, considered to be one of the most antibiotic resistant of all mycobacterial infections. Very difficult to treat. These can be grown in the laboratory in about 7 days, but I had a quick look through the UCAS a list of accredited laboratories, and I couldn't find one that was actually accredited for Mycobacterium abscessus detection from water. So fortuitum is the RGM that causes the extrapulmonary infections of skin and tissue. Colonie, and it's not until quite recently that we've been able to differentiate between colonie and abscessus. So what were previously reported as colonie may well have been abscessus, and they cause skin, soft tissue disease, particularly in the immunocompromised. So risk assessments, well, we know that it's increasing evidence of transmission. We know that they pose a risk of serious illness, particularly to patients with underlying respiratory disease, including cystic fibrosis in lung transplant patients. And we know that this is one of the ones that is most commonly identified as causing severe disease, particularly in lung transplant units. And we have seen in the UK, in the paediatric CF population, a rise from 1.3% to 3.8% between 2010 over a 5-year period. It's doubled, more than doubled. And we know that because of its inherent resistance, treating it is incredibly difficult, often not tolerated, and is a high cause of high morbidity and mortality. So we need to build on this Legionella risk assessment. We need to look at what is missing in the assessment that is going to impact on our non-tuberculous mycobacterium risk assessment and fill the gap. So this is looking at the clinical needs, the governance, etc., all these steps to make sure, is this applicable to managing the risks from these other waterborne pathogens? It's not just an engineering problem. So we have to be aware it's important to look at all potential routes of exposure. Look at direct contact, poor hand hygiene. There is evidence of patient-to-patient transmission for abscessus, so having normal infection control practices is really important. But looking at how patients are bathing, if they're going for hydrotherapy, for instance, water used in procedures, personal hygiene, particularly cleaning wounds and over-indwelling catheters or indwelling lines, shaving, oral hygiene. Every single use of water needs to be assessed and how patients are using it and whether it is of a quality that is safe for that particular use. In France, a number of years ago, they developed a guideline for water quality in healthcare where they actually looked at all the uses of water and actually stipulated the quality of water that was needed for that particular procedure. That's what we should be doing to protect patients from NTM infections. Oh, I'll just go back because that... Whilst I'll say it's not just an engineering problem, I don't know if you can see down here, but they found in one Japanese hospital they'd actually been drinking water that had been connected to the wastewater system for over 20 years. Sometimes it is an engineering problem. So we need to look at all the ways of transmission and exposure. I'm going to rush through a little bit here now. There is a nice table here that was I've put together from 2 publications which looks at the sources and risk procedures and the type of infection. And I'm happy to send this to anybody because I haven't got time to go through it now, but if anybody wants it, please get in touch with me. But we need to understand it's not just at the outlet. We say that Pseudomonas aeruginosa is primarily an outlet problem. Occasionally it can be disseminated through the system. NTMs can be disseminated through the system. And in this outbreak, they found it was in several locations throughout the hospital. It resulted in 15 patients and 4 deaths. And the surgeon carried out the surgery said, you know, it could have been just from their peer theatre hand scrubbing that they actually transmitted this infection. So we need to really think outside the box. So we need to think who is most at risk. CF patients are at increased risk, particularly from abscessus, and for patients over the age of 40, the risk of infection increases, with 40% of CF patients over 40 having NTM smear-positive results, as opposed to between 4 to 20% under the under 40s. So we need to think about possible patient-to-patient transmission. May not be direct, may be indirect, so making sure that we've got proper hand hygiene, proper infection control procedures to make sure that CF patients aren't spreading infection between themselves. Lung transplant patients are the highest risk of post-transplant NTM infections among all organ transplant patients. It's the most common NTM responsible for post-lung infection for the first 3 years after transplantation. One study showed that 375 patients, NTM infections due to MAC occurred in 55% of patients, in abscessus in 20% of patients. So it's both slow-growing and fast-growing NTMs that put these patients at risk. And there are some indications of infections with both rapid-growing and slow-growing in some patients. So their 5-year mortality is significantly higher in those that are affected after transplant if they've had an NTM infection. So for high-risk patients, we need to assess the measures in place to protect them, the identification of all potential routes of exposure, and the effectiveness of controls. And there we have a problem, because the controls that we normally use to protect patients, such as biocide treatment, such as heat, are not going to work for these patients. So for those highest risk patients, how are we going to protect them? Well, the WHO have been saying for many years now that we ought to be doing a risk assessment based on the neutropenic status of these patients. And if they are less than 500, then we need to be avoiding any contact with water at all. So that means nursing them in with sterile water. All exposure should be sterile for the most high-risk patients. And that's going to pose a problem. But we need to be thinking about designing rooms for these patients that are waterless, without water, to protect them at their highest stages of risk. So this is within the WHO publication. It's been within a WHO publication since 2003. And it was, so when there are acute or chronic leukemia, malignant lymphoma, solid tumours, long-term corticosteroids, stem cell transplantation, then they're mildly immunosuppressed. But avoid any circumstances with any elevated infection risk, like drinking water from uncontrolled sources. So what do we mean by an uncontrolled source? So does anybody think that drinking water coming out of a tap is an uncontrolled source? I certainly do. If you think about it, if you look at your sampling and the Pseudomonas that you can get just by contact from a colonized patient, particularly CF patients are very likely to be colonized with Pseudomonas aeruginosa. It's not just MTMs we need to be protecting these high-risk patients from, it's all potential waterborne pathogens. So removing that risk of exposure is the only effective way that we're going to be able to do that. So for some patients, exposure to water should be avoided altogether. And there is some good peer-reviewed papers out there that have showed that when they remove exposure to water, then their numbers of NTM infections drop, but not only NTMs, but also all gram-negative infections in high-risk areas drop too. So this is the way to go. And there's some really good work that's being done in the Netherlands by Joost Hopman, where he has taken out the sinks from the patient's areas in ICU and found that they have got a huge improvement with a reduction of waterborne healthcare infections.